Welcome. I'm Riley Karsh.
I'm Tova Kopan.
We are thrilled to bring you the We Go Boldly podcast.
Let's talk big burning questions, life changes, and maybe a bit of personal business.
Let's be bold and brave together. Are you ready?
I am. Here comes the show.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to We Go Boldly, the podcast. We are very, very happy to have you with us today on this season 8, episode 12, where we are continuing to talk about unlocking what holds us back. Today's episode might be a little bit of a challenge for both Tova and myself and all of our listeners. It's a challenging topic that we're going to dive into. We have lots of thoughts and feelings, and so we'll do our best to parse through all of those for you guys and help you figure out how you feel about it. Beyond that, let's introduce Tova and welcome her to the show. How are you today, Tova? How is life? What's happening?
Well, Riley, friends listening to the show, there's sometimes where I'm having big emotions before the episode that we record. And so Riley and I spend some time chatting with the goal of getting the emotions out of me so I can then come to the episode in a place of peace and calm. And partly because of what we're talking about, and partly because of just the world at this exact moment, both like the little world in my family home and like the larger world, the peace and calm have not come. And I'm feeling, empowered, maybe enraged, fired up.
Okay.
Things,
Yeah.
big things.
Big, bold feelings.
Yes.
And just for everyone else listening, I have big feelings, and Tova helps me with those before the episodes as well. So don't think I'm like some superhero over here. I'm not.
Well,
we help each other.
When you have spent most of your life putting your feelings in a box where you're like, I can't deal with this right now, I'll deal with it later.
Right.
And then you're like, that's not how I'm going to live my life anymore. But I also do need to exist.
Yeah, function.
And it is complicated. I saw a post maybe yesterday or the day before, and it was Abby Wambach sharing Glennon Doyle, and Glennon Doyle was just like, I hate everything, and I don't remember when I used to love things. And I know that, like, I know on one hand, like, it's funny, and on the other hand, Glennon also struggles with mental health issues and has therapy and all of these things. But yeah. I also know that she purposely shares things both for herself and others so that she reminds herself when she's feeling good that, like, you got to keep doing the work because there's going to be days that you don't. And then, the kind of the other way around, she reminds herself when she's feeling bad, like, look, I had these great days. This doesn't last forever. But I was just like, I really appreciate sometimes her being like, I hate everything and I don't remember when I loved anything.
Yeah. Well, it's important that we all recognize that that is a feeling that lots of people get. It's a temporary feeling, and there are things that you can do to help yourself. There are people who can help you with those feelings, and you can work through them. But they're real, and you're not alone in feeling them, right? Like you're not unique in the feeling.
Yeah.
But let's dive into today's topic, which should be nice and light. We're talking about putting ourselves forward and why maybe we are held back from putting ourselves forward. And there are so many answers to this question. And some of them make us pretty frustrated, and some of them just are like normal dealing with your own emotion stuff. So let's dive into the frustrating part. I think I want to start with some definitions, as I like to do, but I particularly want to today because the definitions are the answers to what's holding us back. And what I mean by that is we're going to talk about imposter syndrome. We're going to talk about discrimination and bias. We're going to talk about the patriarchy and cultural conditioning and social conditioning, which are two separate things. We're going to talk about self-confidence, and we're going to talk about vulnerability. So like I said, super, super light show today. But when we look at, why as people in the world, competent, capable people, we're not putting ourselves forward for things like running for office or being the CEO or just any job promotion or being on the board of whatever it is you want to be on the board of, or leading the PTO bake sale, or being the person that people look to for the answer, right? Like, why do we hold ourselves back from that, and how do we overcome it? So we'll spend a little time talking about the why, although in excuse me, in our next episode we'll also spend some more time talking about that why. um but I want to also get to, like, okay, this is why. What are we going to do about it? How do we function in a world as it exists today? Because we talk a lot about acceptance on this show. And when we talk about acceptance, we talk about it in terms of accepting what is in the moment with the knowledge that you can reach forward and make change, right? Like that you can change your circumstances, you can change what's happening around you, you can change your insides, you can change. But we have to acknowledge the now in order to get to the change. So let's talk about the now. Fun times. Um, Imposter syndrome. So there are many definitions for imposter syndrome out there in the world. The one that I am going to talk from today, the position I'm talking from today, is as follows. So it's a psychological condition that is characterized by persistent doubt concerning one's abilities or accomplishments, accompanied by the fear of being exposed as a fraud despite evidence of one's ongoing success. Great. What does that mean? Um, when someone struggles with imposter syndrome, and it's not like a DSM-5 categorization, it's not a mental illness. This is something else entirely. And so when we are struggling with imposter syndrome, it is less likely that we're going to take risks. It's less likely that we're going to feel comfortable making, strides forward. And it's generally speaking, the thing that I read that resonated the most with me is that it's as though you can't internalize your experiences of success, right? So, like, you have a success, but you don't even realize you've succeeded and you're already on to the next thing that you might fail at. And that is extremely uncomfortable. And it's a hard place to be in. And lots of people struggle with this. I can't remember the percentage I read in the research I did for this. I wish I had written it down, but it was high. It was like not 10%. It was like 50% of people have experienced this in their lifetimes. Um, so, what are some of the symptoms and signs of imposter syndrome? Self-doubt, undervaluing your contributions, attributing success to external factors. I think that's a big one where we're like, well, yeah, I got the promotion, but that's because, Bob, Jim, and Joe all just left the company, and that's why I got the promotion. Um, and that's attributing your success to something else happening when in fact it's your merit, it's your work. So a couple other things: sabotaging your self-success, setting unrealistic expectations, lots of perfectionism in there, continuous fear of not living up to expectations, and burnout. So those are some of the symptoms and signs of imposter syndrome. um, let's talk about that a little bit. uh, what does that mean for us?
Well, I was thinking, in addition to your successes, sort of not not disregarding isn't the right word, but undervaluing your successes or attributing successes to external factors. I think often someone who's struggling with this will contribute their failures to only internal factors.
Yes.
So, right, so you won't, like, you don't get a job and you don't think, well, these other two people have actually been working towards getting this job for the last like 5 years, and I've really only shown interest in it in the last 6 months. Like, obviously, you could be incredibly capable and wonderful at that job, but if other people are equally as capable and have been working towards it longer, it just makes sense that they would get it. But instead, you would frame it um, as your personal failings. So it's like, your success is because of other people, but your failings is only because of you. And I think that imposter syndrome, it is prevalent in at least 50% of society. It is more prevalent in women than men, but not only women experience it by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, I think that there are lots of jokes and tropes about, the mediocre white man, and they're a trope because they're true some of the time. And there are, comments about people failing up, right? And it seems that women don't really get the benefit of the doubt to fail up. People of color don't get the benefit of the doubt to fail up. Women of color, like, definitely don't get the
Yep.
benefit of the doubt to fail up. Um, but so there, some of these things are there because they are true. But what I will also say, and I know we're not quite talking about it yet, but it's something that I think is really important to frame this whole conversation and the next conversation we have in a couple of weeks, where we dig even deeper into some of this. That and maybe we're about to say this, but I do just want to have it as a frame, even when we're talking about imposter syndrome, that when we're talking about some of these things, we are talking about systemic issues, and not even the feeling of imposter syndrome, while very personal, is also part of a systemic issue. And we are not talking about necessarily an individual person, right? Like, even Harvey Weinstein and all of that horribleness is reflective of a much larger systemic issue. And you can blame him and a lot on him and his power, but it's still a systemic issue. And when we look at things like discrimination and patriarchy and all of these things, it actually doesn't benefit that many people in society, even men. And I see it in my own children and my own, as I see the pressures of what it means to be a man in a patriarchal society. Um, there's very few people. There are people who benefit, and that's why they like to keep it going the way it is. But there are very few people who benefit. And that's why I think it's important to know, like, yes, there's plenty of men who experience imposter syndrome. I think that it hits women harder because they have the double whammy of potentially, well, they're a woman, and then potentially social class or a variety of reasons that they may feel like they don't belong. But it is there for everyone. And I just want to mention that.
Yeah. So one of the big takeaways from imposter syndrome and people who struggle with imposter syndrome is that it leaves you feeling like you're on the outside and like you don't belong and you don't fit in and you're not good enough, and that train of thought, right? And so what happens, and we're going to dive into this a little bit more, is that in the world in which we live, obviously there is systemic bias, right? There is discrimination. And so there's also imposter syndrome. And the question for each of us becomes, well, I'm feeling like an outsider. I'm feeling like I'm a fraud. I'm feeling like I don't fit in. Is it because there is a systemic situation going on that is making me feel that way and that's real? Or is it imposter syndrome? Or is it a combination of the two? Um, and I think that that is a confusing and challenging conversation to have, but it's necessary, right? We have to acknowledge that there is systemic bias, there is discrimination, there is all of that in existence, and it implicates all of us, and it interrupts our ability to push ourselves forward, to ask for more, to be more, and to be considered for more. And it does that in ways that are very different for men and women, in ways that are different for women of color, men of color. There's so many nuances in this conversation that have to come into play and have to be acknowledged and recognized, because you can't simply say to someone, you have imposter syndrome, work on it, get over it, and then ask for a raise, right? Like, what are the other intersecting factors that are coming into play?
I mean, I'm really glad you mentioned the race, because that's what I was thinking of as where all of these intersecting factors come to play, right? Is, all right, women make less than men do. Um, Black women Latino women, I mean, it's significantly less than white men do. But white women make less than white men do, and men in general. So that is a thing. One of the reasons, and this is not the fault of women, but this is one of the reasons that women make less money, is because they ask for less money. So that feels icky to even say, and it feels icky to talk about. It feels like victim blaming,
Right.
like, and it feels very uncomfortable, because the fact is, if women just ask for more money, they're still not going to make as much as men. Like,
Exactly.
right. And so that's kind of where you can see how they're all combining, because, I listened to, I was on Instagram and I saw an old interview of Katherine Hagel, who had this reputation for being rude and nasty. And for all I know, she is. Who knows? But
Right.
like, but she was like, I'm not any of those things. I actually think I'm a very polite person, nice person. And I'm guessing she is, because she keeps getting jobs. Um, but although there are really nasty people that get jobs, so whatever. But in that industry, like, I just
Yes.
found out an
Yes.
actor I really liked apparently is awful, and I was just like, oh man. But she was like, the way she answered it was, she's like, I don't think I'm rude. I would never intentionally be unkind to somebody, but I do stand up for myself, and I do ask for what I need, and
Yeah.
and so it's like, it's hard to figure out how it works, but it's one of those both and situations,
Yeah.
right? Women or people, we have imposter syndrome. And sometimes we have imposter syndrome in rooms where we do belong. And sometimes the reason we feel like we don't belong is because we don't belong. And I don't
Right.
mean to say that the rooms that we've all been into as two women who used to be practicing attorneys, how many rooms, and forget being as a practicing attorney, um as a client manager now, how many times have I been in a room where I am one of where I'm the only woman in the room, or I am one of two women and the other woman is an admin. And so the fact is, I don't belong. If we're playing, Sesame Street, and it's which one of these
Yeah.
don't belong, and there's three boys and a girl, it's the girl that doesn't belong. Now, I belong in that room,
Right.
but I also don't belong in that room. And it is hard as a man or a woman, because a man could walk in and see Ivy League degrees everywhere, or he could be the first one to have graduated from college in his family,
Right.
or there's a variety of things that make you feel like you don't belong. The easiest one, because you can just see for the most part, looking, for the most part, I'm trying to teach my kids that that's not always true,
Right.
but you can see that there's a gender inequity. But there's so like, when we think back, and now that I've thought of this Sesame Street example, I can't get it out of my head, be because there's like, you want to look at those four boxes where you see three boys and a girl, and you want to say everyone belongs. But that was not the game, right? The game
Yep.
was to say which one was different. And so it is, imposter syndrome is basically overcoming a comparison game, and also assumptions that are being made. Because looking around a room, if I walk into a room of all men, I don't know which one went to community college at night to go to college and then maybe go to law school. I don't know which one is the first in his family to go to law school. I don't know which one, you know, um, took a non-traditional path, or which men in the room have families and are not just the primary breadwinner, but also the primary carer of the house. I don't know which ones aren't the primary breadwinner. Like, I don't know the nuances.
Yeah.
But I walk into a room in New Jersey of a bunch of attorneys, and it's all white men, and I make a lot of snap judgments. So, and many of them are true. which makes it hard. So it's like this combination with imposter syndrome of like, some of it is in our head and so much of it isn't. And then it's saying, well, even the stuff that isn't in your head doesn't mean you don't belong where you are.
Right. Right. It's figuring out that nuance, which is extremely, extremely challenging. So we're going to take a quick break, our first break. And when we come back, let's finish up some definitions to make sure that we're all sort of starting from the same place. And then we'll keep talking about this. So we'll be right back, everyone.
Know what I really love to do?
Take baths, go for walks, read, drink margaritas, hike.
Yeah, not what I was referring to. You know, we're recording a commercial right now.
I do, but I'm thinking outside the box, being adaptable.
As I was saying, what I love to do is host our live monthly workshops.
Oh, right. That's what we were talking about. Me too. They are a lot of fun to put together and host every month. And we can bring margaritas, so
Join us for live conversation as we get a bit deeper into topics near and dear to our hearts. We go through everything from self-care to setting boundaries.
we share coaching tips, practical advice, and take questions from the audience. It's a whole lot of fun.
Sign up for our newsletter today at goboldlyinitiative.com/contact to make sure you hear about all the upcoming Go Boldly workshops.
You definitely don't want to miss out. Now, back to that show. All right, welcome back to the show. Before our break, we were talking about, the challenging nuances of imposter syndrome and how we figure out like what's really at play. I said that I wanted to get back to definitions, and I do. So, let's talk about what is discrimination. I mean, I think everyone understands what discrimination is, but just in case, Merriam-Webster likes to tell us definitions. So, Merriam-Webster says discrimination is prejudiced or prejudicial outlook, action, or treatment, racial discrimination, the act, practice, or an instance of discriminating categorically rather than individually. Um, I think that that's a pretty good definition. I think it's pretty inclusive, though I'm open to being corrected should anyone have other thoughts on that. I also want to talk about what is the patriarchy, because it's a word that's thrown around all the time, and I don't know that everyone knows what it means. And I want to talk about cultural conditioning. So the patriarchy, again, Merriam-Webster defines the patriarchy as a social organization marked by the supremacy of the father in the clan or family, the legal dependence of wives and children, and the reckoning of descent and inheritance in the male line. Broadly, control by men of a disproportionately large share of power. I think that is the definition, right? Control by men of a disproportionately large share of power. And before people get all up in arms and go, well, not all men, this is a systemic condition. Sure, not all men, but lots of them, way more than women, right? So we're talking about systems. We're not talking about individuals. And I think go ahead.
I was just going to say, and I also want to add, in many cases, it's not because those men did anything
Correct.
specifically. Just like Riley and I, as white women, benefit from a system of white supremacy, whether we want to or not. Men benefit from a system of the patriarchy, whether they want to or not.
Right.
Now, we can have lots of conversations about dismantling it.
Yes.
That's a different, maybe.
That's another episode. We're getting there.
Yeah, but just so we're clear, like they benefit whether they want to or not.
Yeah. And a whole part of this conversation is cultural conditioning. And what is that? It's a process through which we absorb and interpret the influences, norms, and messaging from our environment and translate them into what we believe to be acceptable behaviors. So cultural conditioning, I think, is a huge factor in all of these conversations, because what we are taking in as normal as okay, as the way in which we should live in the world and relate to each other has to reflect our values. And if you're not thinking about patriarchy, misogyny, imposter syndrome, discrimination, bias, all of these things, if you're not thinking about that ever, if you're not incorporating that into your cultural conditioning, then you're participating in it. I mean, you're participating in it no matter what you do, but you're actively participating in it. Um, so, one of the things I was reading in the research is I think is extremely helpful in this conversation and is true. It's that when we're unaware of cultural conditioning, it can act as a force against our ability to evolve, right? If we don't even know that our beliefs are stemming from some cultural condition that we have experienced throughout our lives, then how could we possibly change them? So you have to start to work on your self-awareness. You have to start to think about, well, why am I thinking this way? Why am I not, standing up for the other women in the room? Why am I thinking negatively about this strong, you know, assertive female? Why am I having those feelings? Why am I having those thoughts? What in my life or in the evolution of my family has caused me to feel this way? So it's an awareness factor that becomes, I think, extremely important in the conversation.
Yeah. I mean, and I say that with a sigh because as I'm trying to raise three boys, this desire for normal and for rules and for the way things are supposed to be is so strong. And it's particularly strong in my middle schooler.
Mm-hmm.
And it kills me because I have tried so hard in his life to encourage him to not have to be rule bound, but I know that he is more than even his brothers from a personality perspective. And it is so scary in middle school to be different at all. I mean, it's scary in the world, but I think as we get older, we realize that there's always people that are kind of different in the same way we're different. So we're
Right.
never like on our own.
It's less lonely for
It's
sure.
less lonely. But in middle school, and so I see him on one hand like fighting the good fight and trying to understand differences and nuance and things like that. And on the other hand, it is so hard for him to not just want to be normal and whatever that is. And I think that what the best I can do, at least for now, is to keep him being aware of the world. And so that when we get past this moment in time and he grows a little and matures and gets more comfortable with who he is, no matter who he is and where it fits in the world, he will hopefully have a lot of these lessons because I think that we it is so easy to not even realize it's happening until just because you're not paying attention.
Yeah. Yes. So having, sort of laid out those definitions, talked about the framework we're working in, let's go back to the original question of, well, how do we put ourselves forward in this world, right? Like, how do we get past the things that are holding us back? And what is really holding us back? Obviously, all the things we just talked about are holding us back, but then there's, much more personal things. There's fear. There is, the unwillingness to be vulnerable. There is um, wanting to belong, fear of rejection. There's so many things that hold us back from reaching for whatever it is that we want, whether it's to run for office or be on a board of some kind, or all of the things we've talked about. So what do we do, right? Like, that's, I think, ultimately the question. What do we do about how we feel given the world we're living in, given that we accept that this is the world as it is right now? How do we move forward? Because otherwise, like, if you don't start thinking about that, then it gets very overwhelming. You get very angry. Ask us how we know. And it becomes hard to do anything, right? Like it's immobilizing, it's paralyzing to sit in that feeling of frustration. So there are so many things we can do. Let's talk about vulnerability because it's one of our favorite topics, and Brené Brown talks about it, and we love her. And I think it's really, really key for this conversation. So, again, Merriam-Webster defines vulnerability as capable of being physically or emotionally wounded, open to attack or damage, assailable, vulnerable to criticism. That's a little bit of a painful definition, in my opinion. Um, I don't know about you guys, but like we talk about this a lot. Sometimes words are perceived in a very negative way when they don't need to be. Like there doesn't need to be a judgment attached to a word. So Brene Brown's interpretation of vulnerability is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure, right? If you're going to be vulnerable, that's what it is. And I think that is a more accurate description when we are being objective, when we're taking out the sort of cultural conditioning that applies to vulnerability, where we think of vulnerability as weakness and something that is going to hurt us. And it doesn't have to. In fact, it can and often does the opposite. Um, so, in order really to be courageous and take steps forward, you have to be willing to be vulnerable. It's hard.
You know,
Like that's my big summary. It's hard.
it's really hard. And I think a lot of this has to do with redefining, and we've talked about this a lot over the last season of unlocking what's holding us back, redefining our definition of success.
Yep.
And seeing success as the doing of the things and not the outcome of the doing of the things. So I think also, and I'm thinking about someone putting their name forward for a job, right? But it could also be something subtler. It could be redefining the relationship in your own home on who's responsible for what.
Yeah.
And it can be over, and that's not smaller at all.
No, it's just different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think it's also, and when somebody puts their name forward for a job, you're being vulnerable because you're putting yourself out there to be judged, right? You're going to be judged. That's sort of the whole point of a job interview.
Right.
But it is also a very brave act. And I think, that is sort of the point of, almost, if I had to like boil down all of Brené Brown's research and all of her books into like one basic statement, is that there's so much bravery and vulnerability. And yes, there are things that we can do to fight the systemic nature of many of these things. And we can talk about those.
Yeah.
But if we're looking about how do we deal with it in our own lives on a personal level, it requires vulnerability, which means it requires us to be brave. And that often means doing things that we are uncomfortable doing, that we're afraid of doing. Because, I think, at least in my head, a lot of times men were in position of authority with jobs because women weren't applying. And then they were in positions of authority because they were ignoring the women that were applying. And at some point, the balance gets pushed. And it is a super awful, slow, systemic process. But at some point, they can't ignore us. Or you get someone in a position, somehow they sneak their way in, or they have an aha moment where they go, oh, well, this person's actually more qualified and they happen to be a woman. Whatever the case might be, but it does require on all of our parts, because we can only control what we can control, a lot of vulnerability.
Yeah. It absolutely does. And like you said, I think probably before we started recording today, this is a both and proposition, right? Like we have to learn to be vulnerable and to take risks and to put ourselves forward and to do those things. And we need to work systemically to make changes, right? both have to sort of happen together, and one influences the other, right? Like every time, as you just said, every time you put yourself forward as a minority of any kind, you are strengthening the road for the next person behind you or next to you or wherever they are. Which I mean, honestly, it sucks. Like we shouldn't have to carry the burden of fixing the systemic issue. Like that shouldn't be the case. Um, and and I think that our male counterparts, our super privileged counterparts ought to step up and help, right? Like that should be happening. And I think in some places it is, and in some places it isn't. And it's a slow, as you said, painful, glacially slow process. Um, but we can work on ourselves and we can work on learning how to be more vulnerable and building um, better systems and building structures in which we amplify ourselves and the people who are around us. So, what do we do to strengthen our ability to be vulnerable? Like, how do you do it? If you are like me and you spent most of your life in a, in protective armor and a fortress, it can be very hard to allow yourself to be vulnerable. One thing that the research suggested, and I think is a great point, and it goes to all of our other points, is that you can define vulnerability for yourself, much like you can define success. You can define vulnerability, and you can do this by asking yourself, what would it look like, right? If I was more vulnerable, what would it look like? What would it feel like? Because one person's risk is not another person's risk. It's different, it's unique for everybody. Yes, again, there are systemic issues and they impact so many across the board, but there are also personal risks, right? Like if you hate public speaking and that's super scary to you, that is a risk. I love public speaking now. It is not scary to me and it's not a risk for me to do it. So it just depends on your unique position. But when you start to define vulnerability for yourself, you can get to know yourself. You can increase your self awareness. You can understand who you are at your core, which we talk about endlessly. And that will help you be more comfortable in the discomfort of being vulnerable. Um, Another option, which I have a real hard time doing, but think that is a good practice, you can talk to yourself in the mirror. And the reason you want to do this is because when you start talking to yourself in the mirror, you see yourself and you have these uncomfortable conversations, right? Where you're thinking about things that are uncomfortable and you're talking about things that are uncomfortable, you can start to feel in your body what happens because sometimes we need to ground ourselves in our bodies and recognize that vulnerability feels a certain way and it's not just emotional, it's physical. And so when we start to recognize that, we can work on it and we can improve our ability to do it. I know you feel this, Tova. I know this is like you're a fan of this method, but
Yeah. Yeah. And I also think it is incredibly important if you are not in touch with your body's feelings to take the time, because I have had so I have worked hard on being in touch with my body and like learning to listen to my body. And there have been times, and this is why I will always say it's incredibly important. It's incredibly important in this context. It's to learn what vulnerability feels like in your body and to get comfortable in that discomfort.
yeah,
But the just a benefit, I suppose, is I have had experiences where my mind was saying, no, you're safe. This isn't a big deal. You don't have to worry about this. And my body was saying, no, you're not safe. You do have to worry about this. And it was because your body's incredibly complicated, but it is also a lot less complicated. And it wasn't letting any of the rationalization that my brain was doing getting in the way. And then no
right.
matter what I did, I could not convince my body that it was safe. And so I think that your body is like sort of your biggest advocate. It is one of your superpowers to learn what it is telling you. And, you know, one thing we may talk about in the next episode, and maybe not, but there's a book that I am slowly getting through, not because it's not a good book, but because I have just other books to read, is, the body keeps score. And I think that, we've learned a lot more about generational trauma and how your body carries a lot with it. And so in other ways, like, your body is smarter than you are. Like, it carries this generational information. And sometimes that means it's really hard. And sometimes you have to tell your body, actually, this is a situation that you don't have to be afraid of anymore. That, like,
Yes.
that we're okay. The world has changed and you're safe right now. But it is good. And so I really do think it's really important to stay in touch with your body, to try things outside your comfort zone. I also think it is really important, and I know this is part of this list that we're looking at, of sharing your truth. And to me, that means sharing it with other people. I've recently had an experience where I was sharing something that I was really embarrassed about. And I had overcome the embarrassment, hence me sharing it with somebody. But I had gone like 2 years without talking to anybody about something, or a year and a half or something. And I was sharing it with a friend, and I said, yeah, this is just so embarrassing. And I described the situation, and she's like, I literally have no idea why you're embarrassed. And as she said that, I started to say, well, and it made me realize that I was embarrassed because of old feelings from somebody who used to have a larger role in my life, who would tell me things, and they weren't true anymore. And so sometimes when we are willing to share our vulnerability, what we do is we have somebody tell you, going, you're like the most competent person in the field I know. I don't know why you wouldn't be willing to apply for that job. Or, like, I have no idea why you're embarrassed about that. And sometimes they go, oh yeah, I get it. And they just sit with you. Like, and I think there's benefits for either way. There's benefits when somebody says, yeah, this would be a big risk for you. That is scary. And then they say, but think about how great it would be. Like, like, there, no matter what the reaction, there can be a benefit, I think.
Yeah. Yes.
Um,
Especially if you have learned, which we've talked about before, to sort of curate your circle, right?
yeah.
Like, you need to know who you're talking to and choose wisely. I think that's, you know, I think that's a really important part of the process, is understanding who are you talking to at any given time, and trusting that those people that you speak to are going to be both honest and kind.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, Um, and another thing that is talking about, I don't know if you want to jump right over to the risk taking of it all. Um, but I think that learning that risks are okay, and we've talked about this before, um, and that risks are necessary. And, sometimes it's okay to, in fact, all times, I think it's okay to, like, apply for a job that you're not completely qualified for. I think this is a huge place that imposter syndrome gets in the way for
Yep.
women specifically. I've seen it anecdotally, and I've seen it in the statistics, that women do not apply for jobs that they are not perfectly qualified for. And part
Overqualified for.
over, oh, there we go, even better, overqualified for.
Yeah.
And part of the reason is because historically, unless they were overqualified for it, they would not get the job, because they had to be so exceptionally qualified that they were willing to look past the downside of her being a girl.
Right.
And so, what if, though, we normalize applying for jobs that we want? Now, I recognize that there are limitations. Like, if you're in a corporation, you don't want to burn a bridge of your current job to think outside the box. But what if you just apply for somewhere else? Like, what if we normalize applying for jobs that we want because we know we'd be good at them? We just had someone a couple weeks ago, when you're listening to this, talking about this, right? Natalie
Yeah.
talked about applying for jobs that her resume, when it came to like X's and O's, apples to apples, did not perfectly line up with. And yet she knew she had the skill set to do the job, and she knew that she could do the job and that she would be exceptional at it. And all of us who knew her knew that as well. But it meant that she had to be vulnerable. She had to ask for help. She had to take risks. And I think that, as I know it took her longer than she would have liked to have landed where she landed. Um, but I think there is still success in the doing of the risk taking. And the more that we normalize women or men, but men seem to be better at it already, women reaching for jobs that they know they would be good at, um, or know that they have some qualification for, rather than waiting until they are so super overqualified. Because, by the way, then you're going to go in and they'll be like, well, you really seem to be overqualified for this position. It's like, okay, fantastic. So, those risks are important. They are incredibly important, both from a personal level and also on a systemic level.
Yeah. And I mean, just to highlight some of the statistics that talk about this, like it shows up in early childhood, it shows up in classrooms where the studies have shown that girls are far more likely to only raise their hand and answer a question if they know they're right. Whereas boys are far more likely to just shout out an answer, right? They don't care if they're right or wrong. They just think maybe they know. Um, and that is cultural conditioning right there at work, because girls and boys are not smarter or less smart than each other. And there is no reason that girls should feel like they can't just take a chance and throw out an answer that might or might not be wrong. It doesn't make any sense, right? Like logically, if you look at it from way up in the sky, your what is it, 20,000 foot view, there's no logic to it. It is purely conditioned. It is purely conditioned into us that this is how we should behave, that we have to be perfect, that we have to be right, that we have to know what we're talking about before we start talking. Um, and while it's nice to know the answer, it's also nice to take a chance and try and experiment and evolve. And so if we want to change this, it has to start early. It has to start with how we raise our children and how we educate our children and the media that they are exposed to. All of those things have to change in order for this to change.
And just to highlight once again how this is failing our boys and our girls. If the question is, what's 5 times 5? Yeah, boys are going to raise their hand and be like, 23, 26. They don't care if it's wrong. And girls are going to wait and remember, do their times tables and be like, oh, it's 25, right?
Mm-hmm.
If the question is, how was Heathcliff feeling on the moors? And I don't remember anybody else's name in that book, but I wrote about it in my AP English exam. When such and such happened, how was he feeling? What do you think he was thinking?
Right.
The boy isn't raising his hand. It's why when you have in a binary system, boys and girls separated, once again, in a binary world,
right.
Then boys are given the space to be creative and do other things, because no longer are they going to be like, oh, well, you're like all the girls. You're just doing that because all the girls are doing it, because there's no girls that are doing it.
Right.
And the girls are able to all sit there and wait until they figure it out, because they don't feel rushed by the boys who are willing to raise their hands and get the answers wrong. And they can get the answers right in math and science. And I mean, how annoying. I mean, I have memories of doing a math problem, and I was very good at math and making sure I have the right answer. And in the interim, 87 boys raise their hand and just guess their way to the right answer.
Right.
And it would be like, you don't even know how you solved it. You just guessed. You heard somebody say 23, somebody say 26, and you're like, 25 is worth a shot.
Right.
Meanwhile, I'm like adding up 5 plus 5 plus 5, And so it does a disservice to all of us. But I think your point of it starts so incredibly young is really, really valid. And it's why, I assume if you're listening to our podcast, none of what we're saying is like a surprise to you. But if it is a surprise to you, then there's a lot of unpacking to do, because it's been having its way with you for a while.
Yeah. Yes. We need to take one more break. So let's do that. And when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about how we work through some of these feelings that we struggle with, and wrap up with some homework. So we'll be right back, everyone. In case you didn't already know, we love talking.
True story. More than simply talking, we love researching, prepping, and bringing this podcast to life.
We launched We Go Boldly with the goal of reaching people dealing with the kinds of questions and concerns that we also face.
Things like how to hear my inner voice, how to make sure my habits are worth it and stick, how do I feel my feelings and still manage to function.
After years of personal work and lots of trial and error, we realized we have a lot to share on these topics.
Now we've been broadcasting for over a year and we are proud of our podcast.
And to no one's surprise, we still have a lot to say and talk about.
We sure do. We need your help to keep going. Every episode takes time and money to create, and we would love your support.
So, if you like what we are doing, please support us by joining our Patreon community and becoming a monthly subscriber.
Join our Patreon community today at patreon.com/wegoboldly. We are so grateful to all of our supporters. Now, back to the show.
Okay, welcome back to the show. We are going to dive into sort of some techniques for dealing with the hard feelings that we have about ourselves, right? Like the imposter syndrome, the feeling not good enough, feeling not worthy, all of those, challenging feelings. And we all struggle with them sometimes. This does not account for the fact that there is systemic bias and there is discrimination, and therefore you may or may not still have to deal with that aspect of life. However, if you have hard feelings about yourself, if you're challenged with imposter syndrome, and let me just be clear, imposter syndrome is not static. Like you don't have it all the time, forever, every single second of the day. It may sneak up on you, 1 month and then be gone the next month. That is not unusual or unheard of. So if that's the case, these techniques still can apply to you. The first one I'm going to talk about is the one we talk about all the time. Go to therapy, right? Find a therapist that will help you deal with some of these feelings, unpack some of your childhood, the way you were raised, the culture you live in, the society. I didn't talk about societal conditioning, but that's like the larger scope of what's happening to us around us. All of that, you can start to unpack that and work through it. You can you can work on your mindset. And so if, excuse me, if you need to work on mindset training, reach out to us. We're coaches. We will help you with that. Mindset training is fantastic for changing the way that you look at the world, the way that you receive information and process it. That's very different than therapy, but it's equally important, I think. So those are the two like most obvious, biggest things you can do to work on the hard feelings that sort of live inside all of us.
Yeah, and a lot of other things are just things that we've talked about before, right? Like acknowledging your feelings, accepting they are real. I think it is a confusing little thing about feelings is that they are real and also impermanent. So now there's some feelings that are permanent, and if they're negative feelings or even super positive feelings that you're sort of stuck in all of the time, go to therapy. Because I think even though we don't all express ourselves like 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds for the most part, I don't think the number of feelings I experience has necessarily changed since I was a 2 or 3-year-old.
Right.
I just don't, throw things on the floor as often as 2 years, 1 and 3 years.
Occasionally when necessary.
So, accepting they're real, but also recognizing that they're passing. I do think we haven't talked about this in a while, but I think the comparison game, and imposter syndrome is often another way of saying the comparison game,
Yeah,
is something that really holds us back. And so acknowledging when you're making comparisons, acknowledging that even if you think they're helpful, if they make you not feel good, they're not being helpful.
Yeah, I want to say one thing about comparisons too. So, we often think of comparisons as comparisons to other people, and that's absolutely accurate. That happens, and it can be terrible for you. But you can also be comparing yourself to an reasonable expectation that you have for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that happens more often than not. And it happens particularly with people who are perfectionists, people who are struggling with imposter syndrome, people who are, neurotic about things. So when we look at those comparisons, understand that you may be comparing yourself to some vision you had of yourself that is totally unreasonable and unrealistic. And it's important to acknowledge that if that's happening and recognize it and work on it, because that will hold you back immediately.
And one thing, when it's acknowledging your feelings, accepting them, but questioning your thoughts, questioning your comparisons. You may be comparing yourself to something that you thought that you wanted like 20 years ago that you don't even want anymore. I know we've talked about me being on Facebook and being like, look at all of them. They're having so much fun. They're out partying at night. Why was I not included?
Right.
Well, probably because you don't like doing that. Like,
Right.
why do you even care?
They
Like,
don't let you in your pajamas.
yeah,
So
because they don't
why
want
would
to
they
talk
invite
about
us?
reading books. Um, I mean, maybe they do, just not partying. So like,
Right.
like, so I think it's really important with your thoughts, your feelings, and the comparisons that you make, that you really question why you're thinking that. Why are you feeling that? Why are you comparing yourself to that? Is it something that you truly believe? Is it something that you truly want? I think that, um, and this goes back to being uncomfortable. And this goes back to an interview that you all recently listened to with Leslie, where she talked about success. When things are successful, you make the assumption that everything's right and was done right. And when things are failures, that's when you actually take the time to look to see what went wrong. And I think that, she's learned in her career that you have to question even the successes. We have to question everything, that we're feeling and thinking, because a lot of times we lie to ourselves.
Yeah.
and,
Yes.
and imposter syndrome is essentially like a big lie that we tell ourselves,
Yeah.
when it's clearly not true, but it's
Yeah.
not.
It's
It feels true.
it's the story we tell ourselves, right? And we've
Yeah.
talked about that at length on the show. Um, and if you're telling yourself a story that is based in who you were 25 years ago, 10 years ago, last week, right? It could be. It doesn't make any sense. We have to be curious, and our curiosity is what will help us be courageous and vulnerable and overcome the fear that holds us back. Your curiosity, if you expand your curiosity into everything around you, everything in your life, it can help you evolve and grow and be open. Um, and not fearless, because that's not a thing, but be
Mm-hmm.
willing to sit with the fear and the discomfort. Um, so, we're almost out of time for today, but I do want to say that, we've talked about this again at length on the podcast, but so many things bear repeating. Support systems are such a key component for putting yourself out there. And if you struggle to find a support system, if you're, uncomfortable meeting new people, if the people around you don't support your evolution, start making a change. Start looking for other groups to fit with, other individuals to have conversations with, whether it's online or in real life. You know, make those changes, because that is what is going to help you deal with the discomfort, the risk of failure, the actual failure, right? Like that's what's going to help you deal with those things.
And I'll just say, I don't totally understand this old adage, but like, you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we're not talking about necessarily giving up your friends, although we highly encourage everyone to do a friend like check once in a while and make
Yeah.
sure that you're serving them and they're serving you. But like you said, it can be joining some networking groups with different people that you want to meet, or joining some groups online. I know you and I have had some, well, pretty amazing experiences meeting lawyer moms and realizing a lot of the things that we have experienced that felt isolating, we were all experiencing together.
Yeah.
Um, and so, that doesn't mean that I suddenly ditched all my other friends. It's meant that I added. And so that's just an aside. Like, you don't have to look around and be like, but I like my friends, or my sister's my best friend. Like, when we're not talking about, like, listen, we love boundaries. And if boundaries need to be set them. But we're not in this case, we're not talking about that.
Right. Right. um, so I think we're almost ready to wrap up. The outcome of all of this, if we again go back to our original question, which is, how do we put ourselves out there? What do we do to keep ourselves from holding ourselves back? And we've talked about a lot of different things in this episode, and I think the key is to work through the fear. And like I said, to find that support system that works for you, and to understand that, yes, fear is real, and you're not imagining that you're afraid, or feeling ashamed or feeling embarrassed or whatever you're feeling, but it doesn't have to define you. It doesn't have to determine what decisions you make or your willingness to be vulnerable. You can feel your feelings without having them direct every step you take in your life. So I'm going to leave you with that and some homework for the week, and then we'll let you all get to your day. But this week, we want you to consider this. Where can you be more vulnerable in your life? Like, in what aspect of your life could you work on your vulnerability? And then we want you to do some baby steps, right? So for this week, take one step towards building your vulnerability. Use some of the techniques we talked about. Use your own techniques, whatever works. And then the following week, take 2 baby steps and keep building on it until you're flexing that vulnerability muscle and feeling more confident in your ability to be your authentic self, to bring your whole self to the table. If you are struggling to find people to relate to talk to start your week with, feel free to join us in our weekly women's circle. We would love to have you there. We meet every week. We talk more in depth about our episode topics and about what's going on in our own lives. And we're there to support each other and cheer each other on. So it's a great place to work on your vulnerability and flex that muscle.
Yeah. And we'll be back in next week with an interview, and in 2 weeks to talk about how it's all the patriarchy's fault.
Until then, you guys, we will see you next week.
Thanks so much for listening to We Go Boldly podcast. We know you're busy and we love spending time with you.
If you enjoyed this week's episode, let us know. Head to Apple Podcasts right now to rate and review our show. While you're there, be sure to click that subscribe button.
Want more us time? Follow us on all the socials at Go Boldly Together.
Want even more us time? As in all the coaching pizzazz. Find us at goboldlyinitiative.com for all the info.
We will be back with more excitement, research, and deep thoughts next week.
Until then, keep on being the bold, brave, amazing people we know you already are.